Hello dear friends, you are on Ruslan Belov's channel, and this is our daily battlefield update from the Ukrainian front. Well then, Trump has imposed tariffs on European countries that oppose the idea of Greenland, of the United States taking Greenland under its control. For now, the rate is 10%, but starting June 1st, if the Europeans do not agree to hand over Greenland to the US, the tariffs will be raised to 25%. Europe is stunned. An emergency summit is being convened immediately to develop a response and determine how to react to Trump's pressure. We will see where this situation leads. Meanwhile, fighting along the front line continues, and we continue to break down developments in detail. So friends, as often happens after a record day, a lull usually follows. We covered that record day of advances in the previous episode. If you haven't seen it yet, make sure you do. At the time, I said there were 9 sectors with confirmed advances, but in the end, there were even more, 11. 11 sectors where the Russian army managed to move forward. The scale is significant. Over the past 24 hours, the number of breakthrough sectors was smaller, of course. Still, after the New Year holidays, Russian forces have clearly increased operational tempo and achieved a solid result. For the second day in a row, multiple settlements have been taken. Over the last day alone, 3 settlements came under Russian control, more than the day before. We'll start with one of them, a settlement captured on the Kramatorsk sector. This is an extremely difficult direction where the front had effectively been frozen for 2 years. However, over the past couple of months, tangible movement has become visible here. What happened during the last 24 hours? Fighters of the South group of forces advanced more than 3 kilometers and took control of the village of Privilna. In general, a 3-kilometer advance on such a heavy, long static sector like Kramatorsk is almost in the realm of the extraordinary. To understand how long this line has been locked in place, do you see the village of Nelipivske? It is adjacent to Privilna. Russian forces took Nelipivska back in March 2023, nearly 2 years ago, and since then the line of contact around Nelipivska has barely shifted. Only now, on a narrow stretch, a sharp 3-kilometer push has made it possible to reach Privilna. The reason this front stood still for 2 years is actually quite simple. Ukrainian defenses in this area were consistently saturated with trained units. In addition to infantry, there is a massive density of fortified positions, easy to defend, extremely difficult to storm. But now, with the AFU facing major infantry shortages, many trenches and prepared positions may be effectively empty, enter and occupy. The one factor that seriously complicates this is the enormous number of FPV drones. In other words, without FPV pressure, the AFU front would be collapsing daily, surrendering huge stretches of territory. And by the way, those 3 kilometers were not gained along a flat line or across open fields. A standard map doesn't show it clearly, so let's picture the terrain properly. There is a deep ravine here that had to be crossed in order to reach Privilna. It is clearly visible on the relief. And believe me, crossing a ravine while the enemy holds the high ground above is a very hard task. Nevertheless, Russian troops managed it, pushed the AFU off the heights, reached the settlement and established control. One more point. It appears that AFU morale is now so heavily drained under continuous Russian pressure that wounded soldiers are sometimes simply abandoned. Footage has surfaced online showing 2 AFU servicemen, one of them wounded, lying in the snow. And do you know what his comrade did? He simply took the radio and ran. As for prospects on this sector, the key task is clear. Secure the flanks, and then secure them again. That means taking Minkivka, taking Holubivka, and straightening the line along the Novomarkov-Privilny axis. That is the first priority. Second, farther north, the same approach is required. Straighten the line along the Privilna-Pazino axis. To do that, Bondan and Kromivka must be taken. In addition, the area contains a network of bunkers and fortifications along ravines and tree lines. And all of that requires systematic control. Only then can we speak of full and stable control of the sector. The broader operational objective of these advances is to reach Malinivka. From there, using the high ground, the distance to Kramatorsk is not that large, roughly 7.5 kilometers. And after that, the discussion shifts to the Kramatorsk urban area itself. That's the situation. Of course, I won't make predictions about when exactly Russian forces will reach Kramatorsk, but I did publish a 2026 forecast on my Telegram channel, where I outlined the probability of certain cities being taken by the end of the year. If the war continues throughout 2026, for Kramatorsk I assign only a 10% chance of it coming under control by year's end. The reasons are obvious. The city is large and heavily fortified, and the approaches are fortified as well. For the past 10 years, the area has been dug in, reinforced and poured with concrete, an entrenched defensive belt. So yes, the probability of forcing the city within a single year is relatively low, around 10%. Moving on. On the Costantine sector, there were no major updates over the past 24 hours. The army continues pressing in the south, assaulting Berostok and Ilinivka. However, there remains an issue in the north. Despite the fact that some settlements are listed as captured on paper, for example Klinova, Markove and Fedorivka, the reality on the ground is less favorable. And for a successful operation to take Kostiantynivka, pressure must come not only from the south, but also from the north, to close the pincers and cut the main supply logistics coming from Druzhkivka. Even so, in my view, Kostiantynivka is doomed in any case. If I give Kramatorsk a 10% probability of being taken this year, then for Kostiantynivka I give 99.9%. The AFU will almost certainly not be able to hold this city through the end of the year. There were no updates on the Dobropilya sector over the past day. In Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, however, within the responsibility zone of the center group of forces, positions were improved near Ivanivka, more precisely, north of Ivanivka. A network of strongpoints was taken under control. For a long time, AFU troops were entrenched there and attempted raids into the village itself. They were eventually dislodged, and now an expansion of the controlled zone north of the settlement will likely begin, in order to shield it from counterattacks. But the largest Russian advance, and the most severe AFU collapse, occurred on the Orakiv sector. Take a look. Fighters of the East group of forces advanced along a frontage roughly 7.5 kilometers wide. The depth of penetration varied, but remained substantial, between 2 and 3 kilometers. In addition, the village of Pryluki was captured. If you watched yesterday's episode, you'll remember, I specifically said I expected good news from this sector. And here it is. In total, one settlement was taken, and more than 14 square kilometers of territory came under control. To put it simply, an excellent result. Russian forces are now approaching a new defensive line built along the chain of settlements of Verkhna Tersa, Vozdvizhenka, and Rozdestvenska. I previously showed footage of this defensive line in one of the episodes. Its fortifications are indeed serious. The distance remaining to that line is minimal, around 5 kilometers. That is why we should not expect rapid tempo here. The task ahead is extremely difficult, breaking through a newly prepared defensive belt. However, once it is breached, and personally I have no doubts it will be, the situation will shift sharply because beyond that point, at least for now, no further fully developed defensive lines have been constructed. Of course, they will build them, without question, in an attempt to halt the so-called Far Eastern Express. But in my view, stopping it will be extremely difficult. What else from the front? Have we covered everything? Probably not. I think I missed one more key point. 3 settlements came under control, and we only discussed 2. Objective control footage has arrived from the northwestern part of Zakotne. We remember that the Ministry of Defense announced the settlement had been taken, but for a long time there was no objective control confirmation, specifically from the northwestern section. Now those visuals have appeared. Russian troops can be seen in the northwestern part, pushing toward the southern outskirts. So we can summarize. The settlement has indeed come fully under Russian control. What happens next? Next, pressure will undoubtedly shift southwest, toward Kriva Luka, and from there, the route to Ry-Oleksandrivka is essentially direct. Overall, the Sloviansk direction continues to crumble for the AFU, and take note, they can do almost nothing to stop it. After the fall of Siversk, the south group of forces on this axis appears practically unstoppable. Summing up the past 24 hours, 3 settlements came under Russian control, again more than the day before, and 20.5 square kilometers of territory. The AFU recorded no advances over the last day. That's all from the front for today. Now let's move to the political agenda. The battle for Greenland has begun. Trump moves to attack Europe. Starting February 1st, the United States is raising tariffs on all goods from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland by 10%. And starting June 1st, if they don't calm down, the tariffs will rise to 25%. In other words, these tariffs are aimed at the countries that sent their clowns, their troops, to demonstrate European unity. In this way, Trump is indirectly signaling that he does not anticipate a military scenario before June 1st. But regardless, this is already an open war between the United States and Europe. So far, an economic one. EU ambassadors have been urgently summoned to an emergency meeting in Brussels. Contradictions between the United States and Europe over Greenland are escalating rapidly. According to press reports, the White House has allegedly ordered preparations for a plan to seize the island, while London, Paris, and Berlin are simultaneously discussing an expanded military presence in the Arctic. What could this confrontation develop into, and why does Europe's deep involvement in the Ukrainian crisis prevent it from delivering an adequate response to Washington? US military planners, according to reports, have begun developing a contingency scenario for an invasion of Greenland. The Daily Mail claims that Donald Trump assigned this task to the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC. The outlet links the renewed momentum behind such planning to what it describes as the White House's overconfidence following the successful capture of Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro. However, inside the US armed forces, the idea of such an operation does not enjoy unanimous support. Part of the senior military leadership is reportedly opposed to Trump's initiative, stressing that such a move would be illegal and would not receive congressional approval. Despite these internal disputes in Washington, US territorial claims are causing serious alarm across Europe. In response, the European Union and the United Kingdom, as the Telegraph reports, are preparing to expand their military presence in the Arctic in an attempt to dissuade Trump from annexing the island. London has already launched urgent consultations with Berlin and Paris regarding the possible deployment of naval assets and aircraft to the region. Formally, these measures are expected to be presented as steps aimed at countering Russia and China, and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer is said to view the threat as extremely serious. At the same time, European capitals increasingly acknowledge that shifting the White House's position is unlikely. Moreover, if Trump rejects the concept of additional NATO reinforcement, European leaders are considering tougher economic countermeasures, up to and including restrictions on the operations of American banks and major technology corporations on European territory. The Financial Times also reports that EU countries are dissatisfied with NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte's reaction to Trump's statements about a potential seizure of Greenland. European leaders were unsettled by what they saw as his clear attempt to stay silent, and across much of the continent, this has triggered broader concerns, far beyond Greenland itself. Denmark's Politiken openly acknowledges that the United States now represents at least as significant a threat to Europe as Russia, and, in some respects, an even greater one. According to the paper's authors, this reality has left Brussels effectively unprepared to challenge Washington on a number of fundamental issues. Against this backdrop, Politico, citing EU diplomatic sources, reports that officials in Brussels fear the Trump administration could try to bundle the purchase of Greenland into a broader comprehensive deal on Ukraine. In Russia, Europe's general confusion is being met with open irony. Senator Alexei Pushkov argues that Western European states only remembered international law when the United States voiced claims on Greenland, whereas during Kosovo's separation or the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, they conveniently forgot those same principles. The EU is genuinely afraid of two potential scenarios: the collapse of NATO and a Russian victory in the war in Ukraine. The first scenario could unfold if an armed confrontation begins between Brussels and Washington over Greenland. Europeans would conclude that they are being attacked by their own leader, says German political analyst Alexander Rahr. However, most EU states will prefer to refrain from responding to Trump's claims because they fear losing the protection the United States provides them in case of a major war with Russia. In other words, Moscow remains the main adversary for London, Berlin, Paris, and the Brussels bureaucracy as a whole. At the same time, the Union still includes countries that believe a return to normal dialogue with America remains possible. Germany and the United Kingdom are among them. The leaders of these states view Trumpism as a temporary phenomenon, meaning that sooner or later transatlantic unity will be restored, the expert explains. France and Italy, however, follow a different line of reasoning, he adds. Paris and Rome favor launching independent efforts to reach understandings with Moscow. In Ra's assessment, EU states are not prepared for real combat operations, meaning their militaries will not be sent to Greenland. If the Americans move seriously to take the island, Europe will simply accept the loss of this region. Nobody in Brussels wants a direct confrontation with the United States, and the old world has no desire to enter into a direct conflict with Russia either. Therefore, European troops should not be expected in Ukraine as well. They would appear there only if the Americans themselves decide to deploy a contingent to the country, Ra emphasizes. Political analyst Alexei Nechayev notes that the so-called coalition of the willing risks being forced into an impossible split, with Ukraine on one side and Greenland on the other. Send troops to help the first, and you could take an Oreshnik to the forehead. The glorious Lviv region won't let you forget it. Try deploying forces in support of the second, and Daddy might get upset and start causing trouble in the Atlantic, or support local separatists in one form or another. But the most ironic position belongs to Denmark. Just yesterday, it boasted of being a leader in support for the AFU by multiple indicators, and now it is suddenly worried about its own territorial integrity. I don't recall Copenhagen's stance back when NATO was tearing Yugoslavia apart. Many people miss that era, but hardly anyone would shed tears over a unified Denmark, he said. Overall, the situation around Greenland is developing in a highly intriguing, yet paradoxical direction, says Vadim Kozyulin. Both sides are escalating the media battle. The United States declares readiness to take the island under control, while the EU tries to convince itself that it can respond, the expert notes. At the same time, neither Washington nor Brussels is prepared to enter into a real conflict with each other. Trump is playing a diplomatic game. He is attempting to pressure Greenland by frightening the local population with the prospect of a pointless war. According to Kozyulin, there is also a parallel dialogue underway with the authorities in Nuuk regarding closer alignment with the United States. This combination is designed so that Greenlandic society points to problems within the EU, initiates a departure from the Union, and Washington then takes the young state under its wing. Most likely, Trump is seriously pursuing the creation of such a satellite state. The EU will not be able to stop him, and in one form or another, it will have to acknowledge US control over the island. Even if Brussels decides to defend Greenland, it will not be able to effectively resist the United States, he believes. The expert also highlights Europe's resource problem. Europe has been effectively drained in military terms by Ukraine. The Zelensky office is receiving enormous financial resources. The European Union will not be able to sustain a contingent in Greenland while simultaneously continuing large-scale deliveries to the AFU. Sooner or later, it will have to choose a priority direction. In addition, over recent years, Europe has embedded in public consciousness the idea that the main enemy of the free world is Moscow. Switching to confrontation with Washington while the threat from the East remains, the dominant narrative will be extremely difficult. Some countries will try to push that agenda, but it will not become mainstream as long as the liberal ruling establishment remains in power, Kozyulin concludes.